There are four Gospels that tell the story of Jesus, but only two of the Gospels tell the Christmas story. In Mark's Gospel, he tends to be more practical. So he skips and goes straight ahead to the baptism of Jesus and the ministry of Jesus. His writing is short and to the point. John, on the other hand, is the artist. His writing is more poetic and theoretical. And so when John had to decide where to begin the story, he didn't start with the birth of Jesus, because that would be too easy. He went all the way back to the beginning of time. And he starts his gospel with, "In the beginning was the Word." So Matthew and Luke are the only two gospels with a Christmas story, with Jesus' birth. Matthew writes like a historian. He starts with a genealogy, a long list of names, generation after generation, until he gets to Joseph. And he tells the Christmas story from the perspective of Joseph. He writes about the wise men and King Herod. Matthew is a Jewish man writing to his Jewish community, and he wants to demonstrate the lineage and power of Jesus. That the baby Jesus is the one truly to be worshipped and not King Herod. We are in Luke's gospel. And he tells the same story, but in a very different way. Luke tells the Christmas story from the people on the margins. He tells it not from Joseph's perspective, but from Mary's experience. He highlights the two women in the story, Elizabeth and Mary. Luke doesn't mention the educated wise men at all. Instead, he talks about the shepherds, the workers out in the fields. And Luke doesn't skip ahead to John the Baptist. He talks about John's faithful parents, Zechariah and Elizabeth. Luke is trying to teach us that to truly understand the Christmas story, you have to learn how to see, where to look. How does God come to us? How does the Holy Spirit move? Who does God come to? And Luke's gospel sparks our imagination because he talks about normal people like you and me. Normal people who would have never been noted except that God came into their normal. Luke's gospel sparks our imagination to think about what happens when God comes into our lives and disrupts our normal. So Luke begins with the story of Zechariah and Elizabeth. And we need to pay attention because there's something very important we need to learn from them. We actually started their story 3 weeks ago with a sermon with Mary Glenn. And in that story, we learned that Zechariah and Elizabeth, they carry a deep pain. They were never able to have children, and now they are too old. They have lived with the stigma and the gossip. Because Zechariah was a religious leader, and yet he didn't have any children. And so the people in that society, they would have asked, did they do something wrong? Did they sin? Are they being punished? And Elizabeth has carried all that shame. But Luke also tells us that Zechariah and Elizabeth, they were faithful anyway. Despite their pain, they lived religiously devout lives. Even when it seemed that God had failed them, they were faithful anyway. I'm sure they had a season when they prayed desperately, when they asked God, why? But when we meet them, it's too late. They've given up. What they really wanted is now physically no longer possible. We need to stop here for a moment, because Luke is trying to tell us something very important about who God is. Luke is trying to help us to remember, because the life of Elizabeth is supposed to remind us of the stories of Sarah and Rebecca and Hannah, Samuel's mother, and Manoah, Samson's mother. All of them carried this deep pain, a pain that is common even today, but it is a pain that we often keep private. We don't talk about it. It is the pain of families that have lost a child. It is the pain of couples that can't have children. It is the pain of those getting older and losing the possibility. We don't talk about this pain because it doesn't seem to fit with the theology that we've created of the way things should be, of what we think God should do for us. And not much has changed since Elizabeth's time. It is a pain that is carried even by many in this room. But what moves me is that this pain that we hide and we don't talk about, the Bible is not silent. The scriptures actually seem to have the opposite theology. The scriptures strangely has several stories of barren women having children. And so we need to pay attention. Because in these stories, the writers are trying to communicate something about who God is. So Luke starts his Christmas story not with Jesus and not with Mary and Joseph, but with Zechariah and Elizabeth. And he voices their pain. He voices their longing. We saw at the beginning of Luke 1 that Zechariah encountered an angel. And the angel tells him, "You will be blessed with a son, and you should call him John." But Zechariah's first response was, "How can I be certain of this?" In other words, he said, "Prove it." And the angel proves it by making him mute. And he cannot speak. Then Zechariah and Elizabeth, they enter into a time of seclusion. In Luke 1, verse 24, it says that after this, his wife Elizabeth became pregnant and for 5 months remained in seclusion. "The Lord has done this for me," she said. "In these days, he has shown his favor and taken away my disgrace among the people." Later on, their cousin Mary joins them in that seclusion because she too needed to get away from the gossiping neighbors. So I have some good news today. In our passage today, Zechariah finally gets to speak. And Elizabeth, in her old age, has her first child. So let's read from Luke chapter 1, verse 57. Luke 1, 57 to 66. When it was time for Elizabeth to have her baby, she gave birth to a son. Her neighbors and relatives heard that the Lord had shown her great mercy, and they shared her joy. On the 8th day, they came to circumcise the child, and they were going to name him after his father, Zechariah. But his mother spoke up and said, "No, he is to be called John." They said to her, "There is no one among your relatives who has that name." Then they made signs to his father to find out what he would like to name the child. He asked for a writing tablet, and to everyone's astonishment, he wrote, "His name is John." Immediately his mouth was opened and his tongue set free, and he began to speak, praising God. All the neighbors were filled with awe, and throughout the hill country of Judea, people were talking about these things. Everyone who heard this wondered about it, asking, "What then is this child going to be?" For the Lord's hand was on him. Let's stop there for a moment. We don't know that much about Zechariah, but I like to imagine that Zechariah was a man who liked to talk. I think this because I know that God has a good sense of humor. God is very patient and God is kind, but God also enjoys a good laugh. Zechariah was a respected leader in his community, so I imagine that Zechariah had opinions, and he liked to express those opinions. And everyone around him knew he liked to express his opinions. We also know that in his old age, Zechariah's natural tendency is towards skepticism, maybe even cynicism, because he saw an angel and he still did not believe. So I imagine that Zechariah liked to gather with the other elders in town, that they went to the local coffee shop, and he liked to talk about politics and morality. I imagine that he criticized the rulers and the leaders, that he had a better way of doing things, better ideas of how things should be done. He probably complained about the young people and what society is coming to these days. Zechariah even thought he knew better than God. He wanted to say, "This isn't possible, God, I'm too old." But we also have to recognize that we are more like Zechariah than we are like Mary. That God could give us a sign as clear as an angel, and yet our first response is, "Are you sure, God? Can you make that a little bit clearer, God?" Or sometimes we just say, "Really?" And so this time of 9 months in silence, it was important. It was necessary. I imagine that Zechariah had a chance to slow down. And then he actually realized, "I saw an angel." And then he quickly realized, "I'm going to be a father, but I'm really old. Do I have the energy for this?" And then maybe he finally thought, "What is God doing?" And as the silence extended longer and longer, Zechariah could no longer speak his skepticism and his cynicism. He could only face God. So what is the first thing that Zechariah says when he could speak? Let's take a look at Luke chapter 1, verse 67. Luke 1:67. His father Zechariah was filled with the Holy Spirit and prophesied, "Praise be to the Lord, the God of Israel, because he has come to his people and redeemed them. He has raised up a horn of salvation for us in the house of his servant David. As he said through his holy prophets of long ago, salvation from our enemies and from the hand of all who hate us, to show mercy to our ancestors and to remember his holy covenant, the oath he swore to our father Abraham, to rescue us from the hand of our enemies and to enable us to serve him without fear in holiness and righteousness before him all our days. And you, my child, will be called a prophet of the Most High, for you will go on before the Lord to prepare the way for him, to give his people the knowledge of salvation through the forgiveness of their sins, because of the tender mercy of our God, by which the rising sun will come to us from heaven, to shine on those living in darkness and in the shadow of death, to guide our feet into the path of peace." And the child grew and became strong in spirit. He lived in the wilderness until he appeared publicly to Israel. When Zechariah could finally speak, he had a lot to say. But he speaks prophecy, meaning he speaks not from his own words, but from the words of the Holy Spirit. You see, Zechariah, he believed in the coming of the Messiah like everyone else around him. But after decades of living under Roman occupation, the cynicism has come in. He had this longing, but he didn't have the hope. Until God came. Until Zechariah was silent, and then he could see that God is doing something. And in his response, we see that his cynicism has turned into hope. And he could finally see a God of mercy, a God who rescues, a God who keeps his promises, a God who is tender. In the story, we also see that Elizabeth also speaks. Elizabeth needed not 9 months of silence, but 9 months of seclusion, solitude, a time away from her gossiping neighbors. And in the story, we see that she boldly speaks in front of all the elders, that she speaks up in a public space of the temple, and she gives an adamant no. I'm guessing this was the first time she has ever done something like that. But she learns to speak not from the place of what her neighbors say, but from the place of what God has done. Her prayer in Luke 1:25 was that God has looked upon me. The NIV translates it as God has shown his favor. And that's exactly what the name John means. God's favor, God's grace given to me. When everyone else's life went on with work as usual, Elizabeth stayed in that solitude, knowing and cherishing that this is not the usual. And when everyone thought that she was really lucky, she knew this is grace. So she speaks. And we see that her shame is lifted. We need the season of Advent because we need to be reminded of this story again and again. To not just jump to Christmas, but to spend 4 Sundays preparing for Christmas. I'm not sure if you've noticed, but the Christmas story isn't actually a cheerful story. I'm not sure why we try to make it that way. But in the story of Mary and Joseph and all those who saw angels, there's actually a sense of fear and unsettledness. There's risk and there's grieving. And it's in all of that chaos that there's also awe and hope. And so our celebrations in this season are not separate from our lamenting. Our joy is not separate from our pain. Instead, we learn to hold them together in a holy longing. This is what Advent is meant to teach us. How do we hold the deep aches of our soul and the cries of the people and the groanings of this earth and still celebrate Christ and still carry gratitude? Longing is not the same as hope. We carry our longings even when it's very hard to see any signs or possibilities of hope. It's in those circumstances where we can't even fathom hope because all we can think about is survival. Our longings, they recognize that something is not right. Our longings, they are a sort of lamenting that things are not as we expected them to be. And in this season, we learn to hold them. To not skip ahead too quickly to the platitudes that everything will be okay and everything turns out well. But longing is to stay in this uncomfortable space that we know what's good and we know what's right, and yet we can't see it. And longing is not the same as our desires. We may desire money, but our longing is actually for security, safety, stability. We may desire community, but our longing is to be seen and to be heard. Our desires can be confusing. They can lead us in all kinds of directions as we try to pursue them. But our longings, they can only bring us to God. Because we have come to the point where we realize there is no other way but God. And longing is not the same as patience. You remember when your teachers and your parents told you, just be patient, wait your turn. And longing requires waiting, but it is not the same as patience because we don't know how long. It could be all our lives. In Zechariah's time, there were many who were waiting, but there were only a few who were ready to see. Zechariah's family and their neighbors, they had wonder, they had curiosity about all these events, but only a few were ready to believe. And so in longing, we wait because we know that God is there. And in longing, we do have hope. Even though we cannot see it, we have hope simply because God exists. And so in this season, when we tend to spend extra time with family, it's okay that we also especially miss those we've lost. And in the season when we give gifts, we also notice what we don't have. In this season when the streets are especially busy, we know that there are unseen people living in the lofts above the streets, that they feel especially alone. So you don't need to fake cheerfulness in this season. To truly honor Christmas is to hold all of these things together in a holy longing. Elizabeth and Zechariah, they carried their longing for most of their lives. And even then, they realized that what they were really longing for was not a child, but for God to move. And so Elizabeth and Zechariah represent for us the season of Advent. The tradition of Advent is to light these 4 candles. They represent hope and love, joy and peace. And it's not that we have these things. We light these candles because we don't have them yet. And the flames represent our longings. In the first week, we lit the candle of hope because there is such desperation. In the second week, we lit the candle of love because there is too much hate. This morning, we lit the candle of joy, acknowledging that there are those in darkness and despair. In the last Sunday, we light the candle of peace, knowing there is great violence. These candles hold our longings. And on Christmas Eve, we light the Christ candle in the middle. Because in all of our longings, there is the presence of Jesus. Why are our longings holy? Because usually we try to fight our longings. Maybe we condemn ourselves for not trusting God enough. Or we try to rationalize that we don't actually need what we long for. Or we try really, really, really hard to push them away and not think about them. But in this season, we hold them. Our longings are holy because our longings reflect the longings of God. Nouwen wrote that we wait on God, but God also waits on us. And so the practice of Advent is to recognize every year, again and again, that we are in this for the long run. Amen. That's what God is doing. God longs for all things to be made right, just like we do. I don't know if you woke up this morning thinking this was an ordinary day, that you would come here and then you would go on to your list for today. But this is no ordinary Sunday, because every time that you come here to the presence of God, it is no ordinary Sunday. And if you've felt that this was ordinary thus far, maybe you've missed something. Because this whole story began with the Holy Spirit, with the stirrings of God. It is the Holy Spirit that awakens our longings. It is the Holy Spirit that reveals to us that all that we long for, God longs for the same. It is the Holy Spirit that is moving in us and amongst us today, just as God did in the first Christmas. So I would like to end today with a moment of listening. And if you're comfortable, I ask that you close your eyes. I would like you to ask yourself, what is my soul's deep longing? Beneath all my busyness and striving, all my desires and pursuits, what am I really longing for?